you want to be transparent about it, right? So part of the function of this is we want to make it visible. So we want to like pull in dynamic stuff. But second, then we want to be able to start curating it so that we start pointing out what are the interesting points of view. Right?
It's interesting to me that, for example, politicians are not talking about it.
Are they not?
Are they?
Yeah. I think if you ask them, I mean, they'll talk about it in a roundabout way.
Well, for instance, LAUS,
we're talking about it this week.
Yeah.
we're talking about it and they made a change, right? So that's political.
Yeah.
Right? So there are lots of conversations that we want to try and capture here.
I guess my question was, are you interested in who's not talking about it?
Well, that might be a thing to point out. Okay, and then finally, at the top, we've got a sort of sense of context. This is where we want to be able to pull out stories that contextualize this stuff, right? So, informed by all of this and all of this, we want to think about, okay, so hypothesis. Online arts education, learning how to edit movies online. That's how people are doing it. Kids are doing it, right? What does that say about where's the supporting stuff for this? Who's talking about this? Now, can we find an example and make a story about it that illustrates that? Right? So in this, we want to have stories which contextualize all of this stuff. We also want to have those anecdotal stories that illustrate larger points. The problem we run into in journalism so often with anecdotal stories is that they're lazy in a way, right? It's like, oh, there's this very cool thing, and it's this big, and we're going to describe it. Wow, isn't that cool? The problem is that it just stays that big, right? Or we can talk about this bigger thing, which is like the culture of it, is sort of like, oh, you know, this orchestra program over here is like 10 other orchestra programs that are doing this. Oh, that's a trend. That's pretty cool, right? Well, guess what? If you're not interested in orchestras, you probably didn't pay attention to that story, right? But there's this larger context. It's like, there's this orchestra, these 10 orchestras, they're doing this, and this is sort of a trend of this. But look, it's transforming the neighborhood this way, or it attaches to the larger culture in a much more interesting way, right? We want to make those explicit. So when we're thinking, for instance, about the Spaces project, right? Spaces project, in my mind, is all about that. It is all about how do, like, we could do just the little graffiti story, and they're erasing us in the issues. Should you be able to, or should you not? And, you know, is this vandalism or is this art? If we just do that story, it's just a little story about that, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But if we join it in the context of this larger idea of people feeling pressure to assert where the boundaries of public-private are, who owns things, all of a sudden you have all sorts of ways of thinking about that little graffiti story that attaches it to a lot more people. And if we can attach it to a lot more people, if we can make that context so that people find ways into that story in a lot larger context, that's a story that has a lot more impact. So that's what we want to try and do with all of these stories, is to figure out where are the larger contexts. Why does this matter? If I don't care about arts education, which I'll bet you, what percentage of the population, you know, millions of people, could care less about arts education. The question is, how do we get them to care about that? The only way we're going to be able to do that is if we find a way of attaching it to something that they care about, whatever that is. So we've got to find those contexts that make it bigger, okay? Make a bigger story. So when you're thinking about stories to put in here, if it's a story about the Mariachi Hotel, what does that have to do with the medium context and the larger context? What does it have to say? Why should I care about this? Right? If we're doing a story about arts education, that's if we're doing a story about YOLA, right? That's the Youth Orchestra of LA. How do we make people? What does that story say about the bigger project that we're trying to tell? What does it say about the delivery of arts, access to arts education, sharing of culture, all of those things? How do we attach it to all of those things? So,
Doug, just
yeah.
a question. I'm really digging what you're saying. One thing that occurs to me is, what assumptions, if any, are we making about the eventual audience for these stories? Because that will certainly affect how we pitch it, what we assume about the background knowledge of the people reading, etc. Any thoughts about that?
what do you think about that?
Well, I think it depends, obviously, on where we go, and Drew and we've all talked about our openness and receptiveness as media partners, to seeing where these stories lead, if they might end up, on our, radio stations or websites or whatever. And then, there's the internal audience of all of us and whatever else, Enter 30 does with them. So I guess it's, we're still sort of working that out. But I was just curious about your thought, because when I sit down to do a story, I'm always thinking, A, this is a story for Los Angeles Times readers, because that's who I work for.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's a story that goes on the web and spins out into multiple lives of its own, including being read by people who know nothing about Los Angeles, but maybe are going to be interested in the subject. But that does condition my thinking about every story I do.
So when you think about an LA Times reader and an LA Times audience, what do you think?
It depends what I'm
Who is that
writing.
person?
It depends what I'm writing about. If I'm writing a story about the LA Phil, I hope primarily that people who are interested in the LA Phil classical music are going to read that story. But depending on how narrow the focus of the story is, if it's a story about Gustavo Dudamel, who's an international celebrity, I hope that story will have an international reach. If it's a story about, something much more specific, let's say, the LA Phil's decision to start broadcasting their concerts online, that's a slightly different audience. And I don't mean to say that I sit there and sort of slice these things into, tissue-thin layers. But it is something that I try to be conscious of, and I'm sure everybody in here would say the same. So I think, I was just curious. Absolutely. Because we're speaking, we haven't talked about that audience, and I think that's an essential element here. Yeah. So, just a thought.
Yeah. Cameron, do you have any thoughts on that?
In terms of the arts education story, I think, in a way, I do really agree, because, it will really condition how much background we provide. Arts education has been discussed for decades and decades and decades, and I was doing a lot of coverage on this issue with LA Unified this past week, and what I was doing was trying to give people context for those who are coming brand new, who are like, oh, my kid's going to get this new core subject. What does that mean and why does it matter? So give them a bit of that background history of what's happened and what the district has done. But if I were writing it specifically for artists, I probably, they know they've been part of the system, I would have focused a little more narrowly in that band. So I think it does really help to think about that, only because if we're reaching for a much broader audience, they're not going to be aware. We're going to have to say, why does this matter to you?
Right.
The question might be, who has a right to arts education? Or, if it's an access issue, it's probably going to be a much larger base. People who might not even know that they don't have access.
Right. Do you have any thoughts on this, Drew?
Well, something that I think that's interesting, talking about Reed's point about your audience, something that has happened for us since we're only online, and is that we know exactly where our audience is, because you can track where all the clicks are coming from, right? And so that actually changes the way that we write the stories. Because for us, since we have contributors in 11 different counties, we start seeing demand change, where we see We get a lot of traffic here in LA, we get a lot in San Diego, Tijuana area, but we get a lot in Riverside. And so then starting to really realize, you know, how do we tell these stories of things that are happening in LA to this audience in Riverside? So for us, we kind of have more of a, not global, but like global for in the sense of all of Southern California. So, so in some cases you have to tell that story, you have to introduce people to it, but then also you know that your audience is also artists too, so people who are really tied in. So it's kind of navigating all of those different realms. You know.
So this is this isn't actually just a journalism question, it's actually an arts question. Arts organizations, artists are constantly sort of thinking is sort of like, they used to do it on is the dumb scale, right? Is like, here's the really sophisticated people over here and you can speak in shorthand and you can do it, and then sort of draw the line, and the dumber you get is sort of like, that's where dumbed down comes from, right? It's an idea of how you make it less and less and less sophisticated so that people understand it. I think that's a really horrible way of thinking about it. Because I sort of see it as sort of like concentric circles, basically. In the hook me with a story, like something that's really kind of interesting, and let me go as deep as I want to go, right? So I guess what I would say in terms of audience is, yeah, if somebody is just having an encounter, you know, first encounter, and they're not really into the thing, you got to hit them with just the sort of inherent sort of interestingness of what that story is, with enough access to the background so that you can go deeper and deeper and deeper into it. But yeah, we got to think about who the audience is for this. My thought is that if we could do it in a way where you build out from it so that people can go deeper into it, then you're not really talking about, you know, a sliding scale of you know, more difficult to understand, less difficult to understand, or, you know, hard, easy, or whatever, but start here and you just keep going, you know, like this. And you can quit at any time, and that's fine.
One thing I just wanted to add really quickly is also have faith in your audiences. Like,
yeah.
For a lot of times, we have stories that come in that seem pretty esoteric. And when it first comes to me, I'm like, wow, this is really heady. Like, I don't know if this is really going to work. And, you know, we had a story about the aerospace industry's influence on the art world in Southern California with development of plastics, right? And when we first got that, I was like, oh man, I don't know how this is going to work, you know? And then when the story came in, the writer wrote it in a way that respected the audience, but still introduced new ideas. And it's something that, you know, you should definitely keep in your mind, is that these people actually,
Absolutely.
if it's written well, it can connect with anybody.
So I see this level is here we would do things like neurological research, right? All that cool stuff that we're finding out. Economic, social stories, you know, what tells the access from economics, social access, online access, right? This is where you start to make those connections down here. Makers, you know, people are just making things, huge maker movement, huge education movement in that way. Industrial arts, you know, Sean has been looking into, you know, various ways people integrate into industries, and they're artists, but sometimes they're not seen that way. There are ways to place stories in here, but that they all tie down to some part of this part of the image. We have, Sasha, did you print out that list of everybody's stories?
Yeah.
Can you pass that around?
Yeah, it's passed.
Oh, it is?
And I have one.
I didn't get one.
You have time for a question?
Sorry. Yeah.
In the middle section, will you find some clues of how to connect to broader audiences? And what are some other ways you can figure out the ways to broaden the story?
Yeah, I think that's where you start reaching down to do context, no?
In the middle, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's where you're involving people. They're actually trying to sort it out and
Yeah.
curate and kind of,
Yeah.
this is important to pay attention to.
Yeah.
That's right.
So that's a good place to find clues for, to get the story beyond just an anecdote, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So what I'm thinking is that each of the stories to here have sort of multiple ways into the other two levels here. So we have a number of, what are the essential stories that we need to tell as part of this package? If our premise here is that it's not really a decline of arts education, although some of it is declining, right? We need to be able to chart how it's changing, right? Okay, so if we've got data that backs that up, right? We need to create a story or stories that start to explain that. Right? Because what we're trying to, what the premise of the story is, and if you want to challenge the premise, then that's fine too. But if the premise of the story is we're reframing the debate about arts education from one of decline to one of change and access, then what are the stories we need to have to prove that premise?
Just one interesting thing. A lot of people this past week sort of referred to access as, we're changing access, so it's not only the affluent or the lucky that get to have access to the arts and arts education. So I think, like, is it the affluent or the lucky, and what does lucky mean? Does it mean that you're in a neighborhood that has that sort of community that's supporting it? That's something that you get in your school by accident because you guys have parents that are involved. And really, who's affluent? What does that mean? They're getting it outside of school. So I think those are sort of the things that come to my mind when we're trying to define access.
So there's that. There's also, we have to have a story that charts the change, right?
Can I add something?
Yeah.
We talk about sort of access and, because you're lucky or because you belong to a certain class means that you'll have access to the instruments that will allow you to get that art education, maybe online. But what about people who don't have access to the internet or access to?
Right.
I don't know how widely spread that is in the US, but I know in South Africa that's a massive problem. That's what my story would be.
Yeah. And what happens when you don't have access? Do you make your own access? Does it look different? Do you get it a different way?
And at that point, do you cite studies? Do you go looking for what are the barriers to access? Or do you go to, say, an innovative teacher who's finding a way around the lack of access? Just these are...
all of the above, and
Yeah.
also maybe if we know an area where there's lacking of access, no art teacher.
Right.
Going and talking with people there,
Yeah. When you have no arts teacher, you don't have an iPod, an iPad, a computer, access to the internet where you can learn these things, what is it that you do?
Right.
And if none of the kids have computers at home,
Yeah.
the digital divide is so great that
Yeah.
there's zero literacy.
The internet will teach you how to do some art thing, but you can't download a trumpet. That doesn't solve everything.
Yes.
Three
Wait till we get Miles.
Now we've solved the divide.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a look at this list right here. These are two really important stories that we have to tell, right? We agree? And there are probably some more, right? Of the stories that you pitched this week, let's start to take a look through them and figure out where stories go as part of this or part of this, right? So, for instance, the Fairfax Arts Magnet education. What is actually the essence of that story? Have you all read everybody else's pitches? Okay.
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 I would also say, at this moment, the question that Reed brought up of like your audience, LA Times, yours in KCC, yours in KCT, it's important to be realistic. I mean, we need to start getting realistic here. Not that there's any obligation to publish any of this or any of that, but like, there is an audience. There is a reason we are all here. We're headed towards real stories that could serve. So if you have specific, something clicks well, say it clicks well, and that can drive, we need to drive home at this point. So even just going through the list of everybody's stories, if everybody hasn't read them, and we don't have time to do that. So there are certain stories in these lists that popped up. Now's the time to talk about what those are, I think, to some degree. Not that we're going to leave with knowing exactly, but we need to zero in, because they're not all equal. They're of different, and we all know that. Anybody who wrote 3 of them knows they're different. So speak up is what I'm saying.
Well, if we're starting with mine, I broke mine up into 3 parts. My background is more so entertainment and pop culture, and that's pretty much the diversion that people in a certain age group are going with, as opposed to going to museums or, learning to play the trumpet or whatnot. So, in doing my research, I came across Fairfax, the visual arts school, and it's a magnet, so people from multiple areas can come to it. And it was interesting to me that they produced so many Hollywood, not necessarily icons, but people involved in Hollywood. So I kind of viewed it as a school that not only taught the arts, but they also were very diverse in the student population and in creating artists that aren't necessarily